They told you your story started on a slave ship. They lied. They erased your passport, but they forgot to burn the maps. Look close at those old world maps. Not the school textbook cartoons, the real ones. The ones drawn by trembling hands who sailed too far and saw too much. On those maps, West Africa is screaming a name they never wanted you to hear. Judah. Whidah. Ajuda. Different spellings, same heartbeat, right there on the slave coast, right where the ships docked, right where our people were chained, branded, and shipped like cargo, right where the ink on the map and the blood in the sand tell the same story. You think that's an accident? You think the same region they call the slave coast just happened to be labeled Judah by European map makers? Nah, somebody's been playing hide and seek with your history. They buried your name under tribes. They buried your lineage under myths. They buried your identity under black. But the maps didn't get the memo. Those old charts, yellowed and cracking, are still whispering from the archives. Your story didn't start in chains. Your story started in covenant. And that's why they never showed you those maps in school. Because once you see Judah sitting in West Africa, you start asking dangerous questions. If Judah was there, who are we? Where did we really come from? And why did the ships come there again and again and again? Part one is simple. They told you you were lost, but the maps say you were found. And then hunted. Stay right here. We're about to walk into those maps, country by country, name by name, until the lies can't breathe anymore. Step in, zoom in, ink and paper about to start confessing. First stop, Europe. Cold rooms, candlelight, men bent over maps like priests over altars, drawing borders on lands they never walked, naming people they never knew, claiming kingdoms they never built. They called it cartography. We call it audacity. They sat there in London, Lisbon, Paris, scribbling lines across a continent, their boots barely touched. They drew Africa like a beast to be carved, not a mother to be honored. But here's the twist. While they plotted, they still had to tell on themselves. Because when they drew West Africa, they kept stumbling over a name they couldn't erase. Judah. Now slide down the map, feel the coast of Guinea, the bulge of Negati, West Africa, where the ships hovered like vultures waiting on a heartbeat to stop. Right there on European maps from the 1600s, 1700s, you see it, written plain, Kingdom of Judah, Whidah, Judah, Slave Coast, Judah. They tried to twist the spelling, flip the tongue, hide the root, but the echo is still loud. Judah. Not in Europe, not in the Middle East, not in the paintings they hang in cathedrals, right there on the Miafuremena West African coast, where millions were chained, branded, and shipped away. The same coast they later renamed Slave Coast, like the people there had no story before the chains. But the maps snitched. They called that place Judah. Judah. Ask yourself, why would European map makers tag West Africa with a name straight out the Bible if all you were was pagan, heathen, savage? Somebody's lying, and it ain't the ink. See, in Europe, they painted Judah as a land far, far away. Robes, temples, blonde halos over brown stories. But in Africa, Judah was not a costume. It was a memory, a clan. A people, tribes carrying names and customs that made Europeans nervous, names that sounded too close to the book they were holding while they chained you. So on the map, they couldn't just write random coast. They had to mark what they found. A people whose titles, laws, and holy days rang familiar, like pages they'd read, but faces they didn't expect. So they drew. Judah. Then turned around and shipped Judah to the Americas. Europe wrote the label. Africa paid the price. In Europe, a map was a mere weapon. A way to say this is ours now. They used ink like a blade, slicing up continents, cutting through nations, burying whole histories under new names. In its Africa, land wasn't lines on paper. It was bloodlines, ancestral bones, songs in the soil. Europe said, this is the Gold Coast. Africa said, this is home. Europe said, this is the slave coast. Africa said, these are our sons and daughters. Europe said, this is Judah, prime location for human cargo. Africa said, these are our people of covenant, and you're about to steal them. So when you see Judah sitting on the West African shore that's in those old maps, understand that's not a typo, that's a confession. Europe drew what it saw, then built a whole lie to cover what it knew. They told the world Judah was over there, while they were busy emptying Judah out of here. They told you your story started in a ship, but their own maps whisper different. You were already named before the chains, already marked before the auction, already Judah before the journey. Stay with me. We're not done. We're about to walk coastline by coastline, kingdom by kingdom, from Judah to Benin, from Whidah to Ashanti, from Hawan, Congo, to Ndongo, and line those old maps up with the blood in your veins until the whole Atlantic starts telling the truth. Because once you see Judah in West Africa, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, their story can't breathe the hook anymore. Europe been selling you a bedtime story. Snow white pages, gold leaf lies, crosses on ships and Bibles on barrels, telling you civilization sailed in. But when you peel back their fairy tale wallpaper, you find something else painted on the wall. Maps. Old, yellowed ink bleeding like memory. And right there before the slave forts, before the mission schools, before the chains got branded property and cargo, you see it. Judah. Not in Europe, not in the Middle East on some Sunday school cartoon. No, stamped on the West African coast like a fingerprint they forgot to wipe off. Let's talk contrast. Europe at that time was coughing up plague, burning witches, fighting over which version of Jesus could tax you harder. Catholic, Protestant, same sword, different sermon. Stone castles, cold cathedrals, crowns fighting crowns, over land they couldn't feed, over gold they didn't mine, over souls they didn't raise. While Africa was humming, kingdoms stacked like constellations, Benin bronzes that still make museums stutter and sweat, Ashanti gold so bright Europe squinted, Congo courts with diplomats writing in multiple tongues while some Europeans still signed with an X, libraries in Timbuktu where scholars debated the stars, the soul, the law, while Europe was still arguing if you even had a soul. And tucked in that tapestry on that West African curve of the Atlantic, you see labels like Judah, Whidah, slave, coast, Guiné de Juda. They didn't call it that for a decoration. They called it that because they knew who they were taking. Europe told you they found savages, but their own cartographers were whispering on the page, Judah, Whidah, Ida, echoes of a people with covenant in their bones, law in their blood, rhythms older than Rome. Europe was busy drawing dragons and sea monsters on the edges of their maps. Here be beasts. Africa was busy drawing borders between kingdoms, naming rivers, building roads, raising cities, burying elders with honor, not profit. Europe was praying in Latin to a god they painted white while funding ships to drag black bodies across an ocean. Africa was praying in tongues older than Latin, older than English, older than the flags that would later bleed over her soil. So when you see Judah sitting on that West African coast, you're not looking at coincidence. You're looking at a crime scene with the chalk still fresh. You're looking at proof that the people they chained weren't just labor, weren't just Africans in the generic box they like to throw us in. They were specific, named, known. Traders wrote it, cartographers inked it, priests blessed it, kings signed off on it. They mapped Judah before they muzzled Judah. They labeled Judah before they scattered Judah. They saw Judah before they tried to erase Judah. Europe had the pens, the presses, the power to rewrite. Africa had the names, the lineages, the living scrolls walking around in human skin. Europe put the story in books and locked them away. Africa put the story in blood, in drum, in tongue, in praise, in proverb, in the way a mother calls her child's name, like a prayer and a prophecy. So when those old maps show Judah in West Africa, that's Europe slipping. That's the mass cracking. That's the colonizer's pen telling on itself, because if Judah was there on that coast in that time, then the ships didn't just steal bodies, they stole a chapter of a holy people's story and tried to staple it to Europe's version of God. We're not done. Next, we're walking into those ports, Whidah, Elmina, Whidah, and we're going to listen to the names, the rituals, the laws, the memories they tried to drown in the Atlantic. Line by line, kingdom by kingdom, we're about to show you how the same Europe that called you heathen quietly mapped you as Judah, then spent centuries making sure you never found out. First, let's step back from the shoreline and look at the paper trail, because Europe didn't just trade bodies, they traded stories. They printed them, stamped them, sold them, maps. Those old European maps were not just drawings of land, they were confession letters in ink. Look close. On the same parchment where they wrote Guinea, Negroland, Slave Coast, you'll see another word sitting there, like a ghost they hoped you'd never notice. Judah, Whidah, Ajuda, Judy. Different spellings, same rhythm, same root. Judah, not in the Middle East, not in the Sunday school poster, but stamped right there in West Africa, while Europe was painting you as pagan, primitive, idol worshiper. Their own cartographers were quietly writing, Kingdom of Judah, Kingdom of Whidah, Fida, Ajuda, along the same coasts where they chained you. You see the game? To your face, you have no God, no covenant, no history. On their maps, these people, Judah. To the pulpit, these Africans are cursed. To the shipping routes, these Africans are Judah, prime stock, prime prophet, prime prophecy. They demonized you in church, then documented you on paper. They mocked your drums, then mapped your bloodline. They erased your name in chains, then preserved it in Latin ink. Let's call it what it is, doublespeak. One story for control, another story for the archives, because Europe knew what it was touching. They weren't just raiding villages, they were raiding lineages. They were not just breaking tribes, they were breaking testaments. Look again at that coastline, Elmina, Cape Coast, Whidah. Tour guides will tell you about cannons, dungeons, door of no return. But the old maps, they whisper something else, Judah, Judaiorum, Ajuda. They're telling you this wasn't random. This wasn't Africa, just Africa. This was targeted. Not every coast, specific coasts, specific kingdoms, specific people. The same Europe that drew Bibles for the world drew Judah on your homeland, then turned around and told you your story started on a plantation. The same hands that painted white angels on chapel ceilings were sketching Judah over black kingdoms on navigation charts. In Europe, they preached, God's chosen people are far away, somewhere else, somebody else. In West Africa, they whispered in back rooms, we are sailing to the coast of Judah. That's where the prophet is. That's where the prophecy is. Understand the contrast. In Europe, your blackness was a curse. On their maps, your blackness was a clue. In Europe, they painted you as lost. On their maps, they marked you as Judah. So when you hear Slave Coast, don't stop there. Ask the older name. Ask the local tongue. Ask what the people called themselves before the chains. before the cross was used like a branding iron, because the soil remembers, the names remember, the maps remember, and those old charts tucked in European libraries, auction houses, private collections, they've been holding your missing chapters like stolen pages from a holy book. We're going to read them, not with white gloves, but with open eyes. We're going to lay their own maps on the table and line them up with your grandmama's stories, your clan names, your rituals, your proverbs, your don't do that on this day. And we always do this at that moon, because when Europe's maps start rhyming with Africa's memory, you're no longer dealing with coincidence. You're dealing with evidence. They called you heathen to your face, and Judah on their charts. Now we're about to flip it. We're walking back into Whidah, into Elmina, not as tourists, not as broken and descendants, but as investigators of a buried covenant. Next, we're going to crack open those port cities like old safes. Listen to the names of the kings, the laws they kept, the God they called, the days they rested, the foods they refused, and we're going to ask calmly, boldly, if this wasn't Judah, why does everything sound like home to the book they used to bury you? Because here's what they told you. Africa was chaos. Europe was order. Africa was drums and dust. Europe was maps and mines. Africa was tribes. Europe was kingdoms and crowns. They painted the continent like a child's scribble. No lines, no laws, no legacy. But when you crack open those old maps, the ones they don't put in your school books, the lie starts to stutter. On Europe's side, they label everything with pride: Kingdom of France, Holy Roman Empire, House of Habsburg, Duchy of this, Principality of that, coats of arms, family crests, Latin names with gold leaf edges. Then your eyes slide down, cross that blue Atlantic, and hit West Africa. And suddenly the cartographer got real careful. No more random tribes. Now you see Kingdom of Judah, Kingdom of Whidah, Kingdom of Ardra, Kingdom of Benin. Judah in Africa, on European paper, not in a blog, not in a meme. On the maps their own captains used to navigate your ancestors into chains. Ask yourself, if Africa was godless, why are European maps whispering Bible names over black soil? They told you civilization flowed from north to south, from white to black, from cross to pagan. But in the shadow of those slave forts, you find something else. In Europe, they rang church bells on Sunday, then loaded ships on Monday. They preached love thy neighbor while signing contracts to sell your grandmother's womb for profit. They painted Christ on the wall and branded Christ's cousins on the flesh. Meanwhile, on this side of the water, in those dark kingdoms they called savage, you had men refusing certain meats, women covering their heads, people resting on set days, judges quoting law, priests guarding scrolls, kings swearing by one most high above all their carved gods. Does that sound like no structure? Or does that sound like a memory, faded, mixed, but not erased, of a covenant older than Europe's churches, older than their flags, older than their language? In Europe, they drew the Bible as a story far away. Desert, sandals, olive trees, brownish men turned pale for stained glass windows. In West Africa, they lived echoes of that story without the stained glass, without the Latin, without the Pope's permission. Look at the contrast. Europe had cathedrals with gold ceilings and cold hearts. West Africa had compounds with mud walls and warm laws. Laws about the stranger, laws about the widow, laws about the seventh day, laws about blood, laws about sex, laws about food. Europe had maps to carve up land. Africa had covenants to carve up character. Europe wrote you down as cargo. Africa wrote you down as clan, as house, as people of a name you weren't allowed to fully say once the chains closed. So when you see Judah printed over West Africa in that old European ink, understand, that wasn't them honoring you. That was them tracking you. They weren't confused. They knew exactly which people they were hunting. They knew these weren't just Africans. These were problem people. Stiff-necked, law-remembering, idol breaking when the spirit hit right. They needed your body for the fields, your back for the sugar, your hands for the cotton. But your covenant was a threat. So in Europe, they dressed your history in myth and distance. In Africa, they dressed your history in chains and silence. Yet the maps slipped. The truth leaked. Judah bled through the ink. So now we walk back into Whidah, into Elmina, not just asking, who did this to us? We're asking, who were we that they feared us this much? Because if this was just another people, another random nation, why mark Judah on the very coast where ships waited like vultures? Why does the paper say Judah while the textbooks say tribes? Why does the map remember your name while your classroom forgets it? Next, we're going to walk past the tourist plaques, past the sanitized tours, and lay these old maps side by side with the book they weaponized. We're going to match names to names, laws to laws, songs to psalms, rhythms to remnant. And then we're going to ask, not as beggars, not as broken, but as heirs. If Judah was here, what does that make you now? If Judah was here, what does that make you now? Because if Judah was here, then Europe ain't the center of the story. It's just a loud chapter with good printers. If Judah was here, then that means the same folks they branded as tribes were walking around with covenant on their backs and Torah in their bones. Let's talk about it. In Europe, they painted holiness in pale skin and Latin letters, cathedrals scraping the sky, choirs and robes, gold on the altar while blood soaked the floor. In Africa, holiness was a drumbeat, a law coded in proverbs, a feast under the moon, elders at the gate judging cases like ancient courts of Zion. In Europe, they drew maps to carve, claim, and cash out, lines for loot, borders for banks, compass pointing to profit. In Africa, we walk the land like a scroll from the Most High, unfolding slowly, respecting seasons, naming rivers like chapters, mountains like verses. In Europe, they rewrote the book in their own image, then told the world God spoke with an accent from Rome, from London, from Lisbon. In Africa, we sang the book before we could read it in their tongue. We braided commandments into hairstyles, hid prophecies in praise songs, turned captivity psalms into work songs. On plantations, they built off our stolen breath. You see the contrast? They had libraries, we had living memory. They had archives, we had ancestors. They had doctrine, we had direction. They had crusades, flags, and fleets. We had covenants, clans, and codes of honor older than their kingdoms. So when these old maps quietly whisper Judah over West Africa, that's not a typo, that's a confession, a slip-up, a receipt, because while Europe was sketching coastlines and plotting trade routes, they kept bumping into people who prayed like exiles, judged like Hebrews, rested like Genesis, and named their villages after places they swore were only in the Holy Land. But how are you going to call one strip of soil holy and the rest heathen when the same laws, the same customs, the same covenant patterns are pulsing through the forests, through the savannas, through the kingdoms they try to erase and rename? In Europe, they crowned kings with stolen jewels and called it divine right. In Africa, we crown kings with responsibility, with oaths before heaven, with curses if they betrayed the people. That's not just royalty, that's covenant monarchy. That's Davidic flavor in a so-called pagan pot. They painted us as naked, lost, and lawless, but open those maps, read the margins. Kingdom of Judah, Negroland, Guinea. Little scribbles where cartographers heard echoes they didn't understand. They saw fringes on garments, purity laws, circumcision customs, dietary codes, jubilee rhythms, and they wrote it off as native superstition. No, family. That was residue. That was remnant. That was memory of Sinai walking barefoot on African soil. So when Europe said, "We discovered Africa," what they meant was, we discovered Judah in a place we never expected to find Judah. When Europe said, "We brought them the Bible," what they meant was, we brought chains to a people whose story was already in the Bible. When Europe said, "We civilized them," what they meant was, We disrupted an order older than our own flags. So now we stand here, descendants of ships, children of scattered kingdoms, holding photocopies of maps they drew and pages of a book they weaponized, and we ask again, if Judah was here, what does that make you now? Not minority, not third world, not developing nation, not black as a corporate brand with no memory. It makes you evidence, it makes you continuation, it makes you the chapter they tried to tear out but couldn't burn fast enough. Europe wrote history like a court case with them as the hero and you as the footnote. Africa lived history like a covenant, spoken, sung, and sealed in blood and blessing. So when you see Judah marked on West African soil, understand, that's not just a place, that's a mirror, that's a message. That's the Most High whispering through parchment. You were never lost. They just hid the evidence. And now that you see it, now that the maps and the book are talking to each other, the question shifts from, was Judah here, to, what are you going to do with the Judah still in you? Because understand this, while Europe was busy drawing lines on stolen land, Africa was busy raising kingdoms without needing a flag or a pope to approve it. While Europe was arguing about who's human in candle-lit rooms, Africa was living it. Gold on the skin, laws in the heart, Torah in the tongue, even when they didn't call it Torah no more. They had maps, yes, but we had memory. They had cartographers, ink, and royal charters. We had grandmothers who could trace the bloodline without touching a pen, elders who could point to a star and tell you who you are. Europe mapped resources. Africa mapped responsibility. Europe said, what can we take? Africa said, what must we protect? So when you see Judah, Judy, the Whidah, scribbled on those old maps along the West African coast, understand that's Europe accidentally telling on itself, because they never wrote Kingdom of Judah on a place that meant nothing to them. They marked it because they saw something, heard something, feared something. They watched a people holding on to laws older than their monarchies, festivals that sounded too much like the feasts they preached about on Sunday, but never truly lived. They saw fringes, they saw customs, they heard names that tasted like the book on their tongue. And instead of asking, are these the people, they said, mark the coast, mark the ports, mark the bodies, turn tribes into cargo. Europe used the map like a trap. Africa used the land like a covenant. They drew borders, we drew breath. They chased profit. We chased the Most High, even when we stumbled, even when we forgot our own reflection in his eyes. So don't get it twisted. Those old maps ain't proof that Europe discovered you. They're evidence that Europe was stalking you, plotting on you, trying to pin you down on paper before they pinned you down in chains. Because to them, you weren't just another African. You were Judah, the people of the book standing on the coast of a continent they were taught to fear and lust after at the same time. To them, Africa was a place to be carved. To you, it was a place to be kept. They saw land, you saw home. They saw bodies, you saw bloodlines. They saw Judah as a target. Heaven saw Judah as a testimony. So when you hold those maps in your hand, don't just say, look, we were there. Say, look how hard they worked to erase what we were. Europe drew the picture. Africa lived the story. And the story is still breathing in your bones. Even if the map got burned, even if the name got twisted, even if the trail got buried under ships, sugar, and Sunday school lies, they mapped Judah on the coast. But Judah was never just a location. Judah was a calling, and that calling didn't stay trapped in West African soil. It crossed the water with you. Now the question is not just, what did Europe see when it wrote Judah on Africa? The question is, what will Africa see when Judah finally writes itself back into you? Europe drew maps. Africa lived them. Europe used ink. Africa used bloodlines, drumlines, storylines, braids, and praise names whispered over cooking fires. Europe said, this is Guinea, this is Negro land, this is Slave Coast,
This is Gold Coast. Africa said, these are my children. Europe saw a coastline. Africa held a covenant. So when you see Judah carved on those old yellowing maps, don't get it twisted. That ain't Europe doing you a favor. That's Europe accidentally snitching on history. Because Europe never labeled you to honor you. Europe labeled you to harvest you, to tag you, to track you, to turn you from a people into a product. They saw Judah like a barcode, not a bloodline. But Africa knew Judah without spelling it in European letters. Africa heard Judah in the way the elders prayed, in the way the women wailed, in the way the children rocked back and forth when the Spirit sat on their shoulders. Europe wrote Judah on a map. Africa wrote Judah on the soul. Europe said, here is where we find them. Africa said, here is where I birthed them. Europe pointed at rivers, measured longitude, charted trade winds, counted bodies on ships. Africa counted clans, counted totems, counted stars, counted scars that matched prophecies older than any European crown. Europe mapped you for profit. Africa mapped you for purpose. So don't stare at those old maps like they're scripture. They are not gospel. They are evidence. Evidence that the same Europe that told you you were nothing knew exactly who you were. Evidence that the same Europe that called you pagan could still write Judah with a straight face while chaining your wrists behind your back. That's the contrast. Europe, we discovered you. Africa, I never lost you. Europe, you were wandering tribes. Africa, you were kingdoms with calendars, codes of law, lineages stretching so far back the sand got tired of counting. Europe, you were cargo. Africa, you were covenant. So when you see Judah sitting there in West Africa on some old European page, understand, that's not the beginning of your story. That's the crime scene photo. The beginning was in the village songs, the proverbs, the secret names only the elders knew. The beginning was in the way your great-grandmother refused to bow to wooden statues that didn't speak to her spirit, but still honored the God who walked her people through deserts and oceans and plantations and projects. Europe drew borders. Africa drew breath. Europe said, here is Judah, ripe for the taking. Africa said, here is Judah, mine from the making. And now the maps are coming off the walls. Now the labels are losing their power. Now the descendants of the mapped, the chained, the renamed are starting to ask, if Europe saw Judah when it wanted to own us, what will Africa see when it wants to restore us? Because when Africa looks again with clear eyes, no colonial fog, no missionary filter, no schoolbook lies, it won't just see tribes and tongues, it will see patterns, echoes, prophecies in melanin, exiles in plain sight. And that's when the whole game flips. When Europe's Judah on paper meets Africa's Judah in flesh. When the map finally bows to the memory and the ink confesses to the blood. Europe drew Judah like a bedtime story, soft lines, quiet ink, neatly dressed in Latin and lies. Africa lived Judah like a storm, drums, dust, names carved in tongue and scar, stories carried in the breath of grandmothers who never owned a map but knew exactly where home was. See, in Europe, Judah was a chapter. In Africa, Judah was a neighbor. Europe pointed to a page. Africa pointed to a people. Over there, they framed Judah in stained glass in Sunday sermons, turned prophets into paintings, turned a living nation into a crossword clue for theologians with soft hands. But here Judah had a compound, Judah had a market, Judah had a river, Judah had a clan, Judah had children who carried the name like a drumbeat in their chest. Europe said, Judah is over there long ago, far away. Africa said, Judah is right here. He just changed his sandals for bare feet and his robe for palm oil skin. So when those old maps start whispering Judah, Whidah, Ajuda, they not being poetic, they slipping, they snitching, They confessing in cartographer tongues that somebody saw something they were never supposed to say out loud. Because if Judah was only in their Bible, why did Judah show up on our coastline? Why did Judah sit on our shores like a witness, waiting for a trial that never came? Europe drew borders. Africa carried bloodlines. Europe erased, then labeled. Africa remembered, then renamed. They tried to split it. Holy Land up there, dark continent down here. But the maps got nervous hands, and every now and then the truth slipped out, ink stuttering over West Africa, writing Judah where the ships came to hunt souls. Think about that. The same coast where they built forts to cage our bodies, the same waters that swallowed our names, the same ports where children were branded and futures were buried. Right there, on those very maps, they wrote Judah. Not by accident, by overflow, by memory leaking through the lies. Europe turned Judah into a prophecy museum. Africa turned Judah into a survival manual. In Europe, they debated Judah in classrooms. In Africa, Judah cooked your food, married your cousin, buried your uncle, sang in your ear when the moon was high and the power was out. So when you see Judah in West Africa on those old charts, under that colonial dust, under those Latin letters, under those European eyes that pretended not to see, understand that's not just geography, that's a courtroom exhibit. That's evidence. That's the map cracking under pressure and telling the truth. It was paid to hide. Europe had the pen, Africa had the pulse, and now, as the ink fades and the drums get louder, those two worlds are colliding. Paper Judah meet flesh Judah. Museum Judah meet market Judah. Storybook Judah meet survived the Middle Passage Judah. And in that collision, Europe's quiet little religion starts trembling in front of Africa's unapologetic memory. Because once you realize Judah wasn't just in their holy land, but standing on our Gold Coast, breathing our air, speaking our tongues, trading in our markets, you start asking questions they never wanted you bold enough to even think. See, Europe drew their stories like stained glass, pretty colors, frozen faces, no movement, no memory, just halos and hymns, and everybody somehow looks suspiciously European. But Africa? Africa kept receipts, not in their libraries, in our land, in our blood, in our names, in maps so old, the paper itself looked tired, but the truth on it was still wide awake. Those old maps whisper a scandal. They don't shout it, they don't preach it, they just quietly draw it. Kingdom of Judah right there on the West African coast, chilling between rivers and trade routes, sitting on gold and memory like it's the most normal thing in the world. Europe said, Judah is over there in the Bible lands, in our paintings, in our churches, under our control. Africa said, Judah been here too. Europe painted Messiah with blue eyes, soft hands, and good Roman hair. Africa carved stories into rhythm, into drum skin, into proverbs about strangers who weren't strangers, about laws that sounded like Moses, about customs that walked like Jacob, but dressed in kente and indigo. Europe gave you Sunday school Judah, quiet, obedient, living in parables. Africa knew warrior Judah, traitor Judah, Salt Road Judah, Port City Judah, the Judah who prayed at dawn, then bargained at noon, who kept covenant and counted cowries, who feared God but feared no empire. So when those cartographers came down our coasts, eyes hungry, hands shaky, trying to sketch what they did not understand, they had to write what they heard. Whose land is this? They asked. Judah, some elder probably said, in a tongue they barely grasped, pointing at a people, a place, a lineage. So they scribbled it. Whidah, Whidah, Ajuda, Judah, Judah. Messed up the spelling, but not the echo. Because even in their confusion, the truth still leaked through. Europe built a whole theology to keep Judah locked in their holy land, like a museum exhibit behind velvet ropes. But the map, that old yellowed European-made map, betrayed them. It confessed. Judah was here too, on this coast, among these people, inside this black skin you're about to chain. And that's where the contrast cuts deep. Europe saw a coastline, resources, bodies, profit. Africa stood on a covenant, names, laws, songs, a memory of God that didn't ask Europe for permission. Europe launched ships. Africa rang drums. Europe wrote contracts. Africa recited lineages. Europe moved in numbers. How many bodies fit in a hull? How much gold per head? How much sugar per acre? Africa moved in names. Son of, daughter of, house of, tribe of, people of, Judah of. So when you see Judah on those old maps under that West African sun, under that Atlantic wind, you're looking at the moment Europe's version of the story starts to crack. Because if Judah was standing on our shores before the ships came, then those chains weren't just about labor. They were about erasing a witness, a people who could point to both the book and the land and say, we remember, we were there twice in their holy land, on our Gold Coast. Europe wanted Judah in a painting. Africa had Judah in the marketplace. Europe wanted Judah in prophecy. Africa had Judah in real time. So they packed us into those floating prisons, hoping the waves would wash the memory off. But memory is stubborn. It hides in lullabies, in side-eye, in the way Nana won't eat certain foods or keeps certain days holy without knowing why. And those old maps are like a guilty whisper from Europe's own hand. We knew. We saw Judah in West Africa. We drew it. Then we buried it. But buried ain't the same as gone. All it takes is one bold mind, one unchained question, one child flipping pages and asking, why is Judah over here on this side of the ocean? And suddenly the whole story starts shaking. Because over there in Europe, they drew maps like mirrors, maps that made them giants and us shadows. Over there, their cartographers weren't just measuring land, they were measuring lies. Ink dripping with agenda, compass spinning for conquest, parchment pressed with prophecy they wrote for themselves. They carved the world like a Sunday roast, dividing coastlines like slices of bread, passing plates to popes and princes while praying over theft like it was holy. Over there, they renamed everything they touched, Gold Coast, Slave Coast, Pepper Coast, like we were shelves in their supermarket. But over here, Africa wasn't taking notes from nobody. Over here, the land already had a name before their ships scratched the horizon. Over here, kingdoms weren't fairy tales, they were tax systems, armies, bloodlines, treaties, thrones carved from memory and stone. Judah wasn't a rumor out here. It was a place you could walk to, trade in, pray in, bury your dead in, call your cousin in. On this side, the maps move through mouths, not just paper. Griots spitting longitude in lullabies, grandmothers tracing borders in the dust with their fingers, fathers measuring distance by how long a song lasted on the road. See the contrast? Over there, history was edited in candlelit rooms by men in wigs and soft shoes, arguing over how much of the truth they could afford to leave on the page. Over here, history was shouted under open sky, drummed into skin, sung over fires, tattooed in scar patterns and clan names. Over there, they learned us like a subject. Over here, we lived us like a covenant. So when you see Kingdom of Judah sitting bold on an old West African map, under that European ink is a confession they couldn't fully bury. Because for one hot second, their need for navigation outweighed their hunger for erasure. For one brief moment, the map had to match the shoreline, not the story. And the shoreline whispered back, Judah is here. Judah been here. Judah got cousins and kingdoms and caravans that don't start in Lisbon or London. But watch the switch. As the ships kept coming, as the chains got heavier, as the trade got darker, the ink got quieter. Names started disappearing. Judah faded to Whidah, then to nothing, like a song cut off mid-chorus. Over there, They clean the maps like a crime scene, wiping fingerprints, changing spellings, shrinking empires to tribes, turning kings into chiefs, turning nations into villages. Over here, the people still knew where they came from, until enough of them were dragged, branded, and scattered across an ocean so wide they hoped memory would drown in it. But buried ain't the same as gone. Those old maps are like guilty diaries, pages where Europe accidentally told the truth before it learned how to lie in cursive. So yeah, ask that question. Why is Judah over here on this side of the ocean? Because once upon a time, before Europe rewrote the legend, the compass had more integrity than the crown, and the land itself was testifying. The people you're about to chain, the souls you're about to scatter, they're not just Africans in your one-word box. They got names that echo through scriptures you swear you believe. They got lineages that run deeper than your flags, older than your thrones. That's why the maps start to shake when the child starts to read. Because the moment you see Judah in West Africa, you realize either the map is lying or your whole education is. And between Europe's story and Africa's memory, one of them got a reason to hide. Europe got museums, Africa got grandmothers, Europe got records, Africa got remembrance, Europe got dusty archives, locked drawers, Latin labels, and a man in glasses telling you what it means. Africa got old women under mango trees, eyes like time itself, whispering, "Baby, we didn't start on no slave ship." See the difference? Europe points at a paper and says, "This is history." Africa points at a people and says, "We are me." Europe said, "You were tribes, you were pagans, you were naked, lost, uncivilized." Africa said, "We were kingdoms, we were temples, we were Judah, Levi, Benjamin, walking with the book before the book had a barcode." So when you see Kingdom of Judah sitting in West Africa on an old European map, that's not a typo. That's a confession they forgot to fully erase. Europe draws borders. Africa carries bloodlines. Europe says this line here is Ghana, this one is Benin, this one is Nigeria. Africa says those are new names on old souls. We are older than your pen strokes. Europe gave you Middle East Jesus, Desert Judah, Roman roads, and said Africa was just a mission field. But the soil remembers what schools forget. Ask the rivers, ask the drums, ask the names they tried to bury under Johnson and Smith. Why the map got Judah sitting in West Africa? Because before chains there were crowns, before plantations there were prophecies, before they shipped bodies they had to erase stories. Europe's story needs you to be lost. Africa's memory knows you were taken. Europe says you came from nowhere. We discovered you, we named you, we civilized you. Africa says you came from somewhere. You were hunted, you were branded, you were scattered, but you were never nobody. So when that child sees Judah on the west side of the motherland, the room gets quiet. Because suddenly the slave ship ain't the beginning, it's the kidnapping, not the origin. And if Judah was there, if the book's people were on that coast, then those ships weren't just moving Africans, they were moving our prophecy, they were moving covenant, they were moving people who already knew the names. Europe needs that to be a coincidence. Africa knows that's a breadcrumb. So now you got a choice. Believe the ones who wrote you in as cargo, or believe the land that still calls you by your forgotten name. Because when maps and memories start arguing, only one of them got a reason to lie for a paycheck. Europe drew lines, Africa kept receipts. Europe said, this is the Gold Coast, that's the Slave Coast, this here's the Pepper Coast. Africa said, that's Judah, that's Benin, that's Oyo, that's home. Europe pulled out a compass. Africa pulled out a conscience. They sailed in with crosses, contracts, and crooked tongues, writing stories where your name was property, your language was noise, your God was heathen. But the soil never signed that contract. The rivers never learned their language. The hills never said amen to their lies. Look close at those old maps. Not the schoolbook knockoffs, the dusty yellowed ones they keep in the back rooms of quiet museums and paid archives. You'll see it, sitting there like a confession they forgot to shred. Kingdom of Juda on the West African coast. Right there where your ancestors were chained, branded, and shipped. Europe called it slave trade. Africa called it the day they tried to erase Judah from the map by moving Judah across an ocean. Europe said, these are tribes. Africa said, these are nations. Europe said, these are pagans. Africa said, these are priests, prophets, keepers of covenant. They drew you as arrows pointing out of Africa, but the land still whispers your direction back in. Ask yourself, if you were just savages, random Africans, why the need for all that paperwork, all those maps, all those labels, all that church talk to justify the chains? Why mark Judah on the coast if Judah was just some story stuck in the Middle East and Sunday school? Because Europe knows how to lie with ink, but it also knows how to cover itself legally. They left a trail, a name here, a kingdom there, a scribble that says Judah, another that says Whidah. Sound it out. Feel it in your chest. Your spirit knows before your mind catches up. Europe built museums. Africa built memory. Museums charge tickets to see stolen things behind glass. Memory is free, and it lives in your blood, your cheekbones, your grandma's accent, the way a drum can make you cry without a single word. Europe gave you textbooks with 3 paragraphs on Africa: pyramids, slavery, poverty. Africa gave you empires with libraries, kingdoms with court systems, cities with streetlights before Europe had plumbing. Europe handed you a map that said you started in chains. Africa handed you a map that said you started in covenant. So now, you standing between 2 cartographers, one drew you as cargo, one drew you as kingdom. One erased your God and sold you a blonde one. One carved your God into wood, stone, rhythm, and kept him breathing in secret songs and stories. When Europe looks at Africa, it sees resources. When Africa looks at you, it sees relatives. Europe, how do we extract? Africa, how do we remember? Europe, we discovered. Africa, we existed before your boat knew what water was. So when you see Judah on that West African coast, understand, that's not a typo. That's not a coincidence. That's a fingerprint, a breadcrumb, a divine "I told you so" printed in Latin ink on stolen parchment. The same hands that wrote you off wrote you in. They just hoped you'd never learn how to read between the lines. Because once you see it, once you realize Judah wasn't just over there, but also right here, the whole slave narrative starts to crack. And when the lie cracks, the chains start to rattle. Europe fears that sound. Africa recognizes it. That's the sound of a people waking up to maps that accidentally told the truth. Europe said Africa was just tribes and trees. No compass, no kingdoms, no crowns. But then those old maps start whispering, not the new ones polished by professors and colonizers in suits. I'm talking dusty parchment, ink fading, truth still loud. On those maps you see it, Kingdom of Judah sitting in West Africa like it's waiting for roll call. Europe squints, Africa smiles, because Europe spent centuries telling us our story started in a slave ship. No past, no throne, no language, just chains. But those maps, they snitch, they point, they confess. There were people here with names that sound like scripture, laws that sound like Torah, rhythms that sound like psalms. Europe says that's coincidence. Africa says stop lying. Europe drew the lines but couldn't hide the echoes. Judah in West Africa like a fingerprint on the crime scene. Evidence they forgot to burn. So now the children of the diaspora zoom in, screenshot, enlarge the corner of the coast. Why does this say Judah? Why does this say Whidah? Why does this sound like a name I heard in my grandmother's prayer? Europe hears that question and starts stuttering. Africa hears it and starts humming, because Africa remembers what Europe tried to bury. Names carved in stone, laws carried in blood, stories passed in whispers under moonlight, around fires, behind plantations, inside prison cells. Europe says, "You were heathens." Africa laughs deep and unbothered. "We were keeping commandments before you could spell civilized." Those old maps are cracked mirrors, and when you hold them up, you don't just see rivers and borders. You see a trail, a pattern, a people pushed from east to west, from known to forgotten, from throne to cargo. Europe edited the textbooks. Africa kept the receipts. So when Judah shows up on the coast of West Africa, that's not random, that's not cute, that's not a typo, that's a breadcrumb, a flare in the dark, a voice from the past saying, "We were here, we had names, we had law, we had covenant, and you will not erase us with a chapter in your history book." Europe wants you to believe those maps are outdated. Africa knows they're just unfiltered. Old maps, old ink, new eyes, same truth. The story they gave you was too small for the size of your soul. They told you civilization started where their ships landed. Europe, fog, famine, kings choking on silver spoons, plague dancing through stone streets, priests arguing over Latin while rats preached in the alleys. Africa, gold rivers, salt roads, cities lit by libraries, mathematicians counting stars while griots counted generations backwards till the dust turned to names. But in their textbooks, Africa was a blank page with lions. No kingdoms, no scholars, no blueprints, no blue blood. So how Judah end up on their old maps in West Africa? Because the cartographers weren't as good at lying as the historians. See, a map maker got one job: don't get nobody lost. You can't play too many games when sailors' lives and merchants' money depend on your ink. So on those old sheets of skin, before the spin doctors rewrote the world, you see it: Kingdom of Judah, Whidah, Ajuda, Judah. Right there on the West African coast, where your ancestors were chained, tagged, and shipped like cargo. Europe was busy drawing borders with blood, carving the world like a stolen feast. Africa was busy holding lineages, keeping covenants, praying in tongues older than Latin, older than English, older than their flags. They told you the Jews are over there in the cold lands, in the synagogues of snow and stone. But the old maps whisper, no, some of Judah was down here under this sun by this ocean wearing this melanin. They said Africa was heathen, and the map said Judah lived here. They said you came from nowhere. The map said your name was on the land before your name was on the ledger. They said you were just slaves. The map said you were a people with a covenant, a direction, a destiny, before chains, before auctions, before your tongue was taxed and beaten out of your mouth. Europe wrote stories to make you small. Africa carried memories too big to fit in their footnotes. In Europe, they painted you as shadow, background, beast of burden. In Africa, you were center stage. Queens with crowns heavy as history. Kings whose signatures were whole provinces. Priests who knew the name of every star their children were named after. So when you see Judah stamped on West Africa in that old brown ink, under the dust of museum silence, under the breath of colonial lies, under the shrug of school teachers who never saw that before, understand, that's not just a label. That's a leak in the dam. That's truth seeping through the cracks of their paper cage. Because if Judah was there on that coast at that time, in that skin, then the story changes, doesn't it? Then the boats didn't just steal bodies. They stole bloodlines. They didn't just move labor. They moved lineages. Europe, y'all are lucky we civilized you. Africa, we taught the world how to count, how to pray, how to heal, how to build, then watched you pretend we were born yesterday. Old maps don't care about your feelings. They just record coordinates, and those coordinates are pointing fingers now, pointing from their harbors to your history, from their ink to your identity, from their paper to your power. Old ink, new eyes, same truth. They shrunk your story to fit inside their ships, but the coastline still remembers your real name. Europe draws maps like court cases, cold ink, crooked motives, lines like handcuffs, borders like bars. Africa? Africa was a living atlas long before compass ever touched her skin. Routes in the rivers, coordinates in the drumbeats, history braided in the hairlines of 1,000 tribes speaking one buried memory. So when you see Judah stamped on old West African maps, under dust, under Latin, under lies, understand this. That's not a typo. That's a confession. Europe mapped what it wanted to steal: gold, grain, bodies, names. They didn't draw you there by accident. Cartographers don't risk their careers on maybe. If Judah is written on the West African coast, it's because Judah was there, present, known, talked about in whispers and in merchant ledgers. They told you Judah lived over there in a storybook desert, far from your cocoa soil and red clay rivers. They pointed east while sailing west. They preached one holy land while looting another. Europe, I discovered. Africa, I remembered. Europe erases you in the classroom, then sells you back your own image in stained glass and cinema. Africa keeps receipts in proverbs, in praise names, in clan totems, in that old woman's song you don't quite understand but feel in your bones. So these old maps, they slipped, they glitched, they let the mask slide for half a second. Judah on the slave coast, kingdoms with Hebrew echoes in their names and customs, European pens shaking while they wrote what they saw but didn't fully want to admit. Because if Judah was in West Africa, then the ships weren't just carrying Africans. They were dragging away princes of psalms, keepers of covenants, children of a promise. They later tried to resell you with a white face and blue eyes. Europe drew maps to own you. Africa lived maps to know you. They charted coastlines, we charted bloodlines. They measured distance, we measured lineage. They sailed by stars, we were the stars. Scattered, but still part of the same constellation. So when you hear them say, Judah was never in West Africa, ask them, then why does your own map say otherwise? Why do your own archives whisper what your textbooks refuse to shout? New eyes. Same truth. Those old maps are not your origin. They're just the moment Europe accidentally admitted you were more than the chains they wrapped you in. They shrunk your story to fit inside their ships. But the coastline still remembers your real name, and the old maps betrayed the secret they tried to bury. Europe drew lines. Africa lived stories. Europe said kingdoms. Africa said family. Europe said tribes. Africa said nations. Europe said slave coast. Africa said home. On their paper, you were ink. On this soil, you were thunder. They sat in cold rooms with candles and compasses, arguing over borders they'd never walked, measuring rivers they'd never tasted, naming lands their feet had never blessed. Meanwhile, Africa was out here breathing kingdoms into the sunrise. Gold talking in the marketplace, drums sending messages faster than any European horse, libraries older than their cathedrals, roads carved by memory, not by maps. Europe mapped what it wanted to steal. Africa lived what it refused to forget. They drew Judah on the page like a target. But Judah in West Africa wasn't a dot. It was a drumbeat, a covenant, a people walking scripture in real time. Europe saw trade routes. Africa saw bloodlines. Europe saw resources. Africa saw relatives. Europe saw coastal assets. Africa saw ancestors standing in the surf, refusing to bow even as the ships rolled in like dark omens. Understand this. When you see Judah scribbled on those old maps, that's not Europe teaching you who you are. That's Africa's echo leaking through their lies. They tried to flatten you to longitude and latitude, But spirit doesn't fit inside straight lines. You can't fold a covenant into a corner of a chart. Europe was busy counting miles, counting cargo, counting coins. Africa was busy counting generations, counting names, counting promises whispered under moonlight. They were mapping land. We were mapping a legacy. So when you line up those maps next to the coastline, you see the clash. Europe's version, cold, neat, numbered. Africa's truth, wild, sacred, remembered. Judah in West Africa was them slipping up, admitting, we found something here we can't fully explain, so we'll just label it and loot it. But a label ain't a lineage. A border ain't a birthright. Their charts were contracts. Our soil was scripture. And every time their pen wrote Judah by that coast, the land itself smirked as if to say, you see us, you fear us, you'll trade us, chain us, try to erase us, but you will never unknow us. That's the tension bleeding through those maps. Europe trying to own the narrative, Africa refusing to disappear. Europe draws lines, Africa births worlds. See, Europe loves a border, straight lines, sharp edges, ink like fences pressed onto paper. This is ours, that is theirs, here is the coast, there is the unknown. But Africa don't move like that. Africa is rhythm, not ruler. Spirits, not spreadsheets. Tribes, tongues, kingdoms, clans. Overlapping like drum patterns, weaving like braids on a grandmother's porch. So when you see Judah stamped on those old maps of West Africa, understand this. Europe was trying to label what it could not own. Trying to box in a people whose story was older than their entire civilization. They saw Judah, Whidah, Ajuda scribbled near the slave coast and thought they were naming a place, but they were stumbling over a people, a memory, a lineage, a rumor of Israel breathing in black skin, speaking in tones they did not understand. Europe, we discovered. Africa, we've been. Europe, we mapped. Africa, we remembered. See the game? They drag their ships to our shores, hear echoes of Yehuda, Yuda, Ajuda, and their pens start shaking. Because if Judah is here, if covenant is here, if prophecy is here, then the story they've been selling is cracked at the foundation. So they do what they always do, translate it, twist it, rename it, reframe it, until Judah becomes just another region, another tribe, another curiosity for European journals. But the land knew, the people knew, the elders knew. Those maps are confessions, not just cartography, slips of the tongue in ink form. Europe tried to chart a coastline, but accidentally exposed a bloodline. They thought they were mapping trade routes, but they were tracing exile. They thought they were sketching kingdoms, but they were outlining prophecy. Judah in West Africa is not some cute coincidence. It's a fingerprint, a clue left at the scene of a buried crime. Because you don't erase a people without first studying them. You don't bury a bloodline without first tracking it. So they tracked, they listed, they mapped, they archived, then they traded, then they chained, then they tried to bury. Europe weaponized the map. Africa survived the map. And even now, centuries later, those faded papers still whisper, you tried to own this story. You tried to rename this people. But your own hand betrayed you. Old maps, old lies, old labels. But the truth walks barefoot, unbothered, across every line they ever drew. Europe drew borders. Africa carried memory. And memory, unlike ink, does not fade. Europe had cartographers. Africa had custodians. They had compasses and crowns. We had griots and grandmothers. They studied coastlines. We studied bloodlines. See, Europe mapped what it could reach. Africa mapped what it could remember. Big difference. Those old maps, the ones that whispered Judah along West Africa's spine, they weren't accidents. They were confessions, ink slick slip-ups, moments when the colonizer's pen got a little too honest. Because before Europe started carving us up like a Sunday roast, Before they renamed kingdoms like they were rearranging furniture, there were people along that coast who knew exactly who they were. Not tribes like they like to mumble, nations, houses, lineages, clans carrying names that rang like scripture and drum beats at the same time. Europe called it Guinea. They called it the Slave Coast. But if you lean in close to those old maps, past the Latin, past the lies, you see something else. Juda, Whidah, Ajuda. Different spellings, same echo. Why? Because when Europeans first showed up, they didn't meet Africans as some blank, nameless mass. They met people who told them stories, told them where they came from, told them who their fathers were, and their fathers' fathers, and the covenant their people walked with. Europe heard those stories, wrote them down, just enough to trade on them, then tried to bury the rest. They drew borders. We carried bloodlines. They said, "This is the slave coast." We said, "This is home." They said, "These are Negroes." We said, "We are nations." And those old maps, they're the receipts they forgot to burn, because you don't write Judah on a coastline unless somebody there is calling that name, singing that name, praying that name into the soil. Europe mapped resources. Africa mapped responsibility. Europe saw bodies to ship. Africa saw covenants to keep. They chased gold, pepper, and profit. We guarded names, totems, and totems of memory. So when you see Judah stamped on West Africa, understand, that's not Europe honoring us. That's Europe exposing itself. Proof that before the chains, before the auctions, before the renaming and the erasing, there were people on that shore whose identity was so loud, so undeniable, even the colonizer's map had to nod its head and write it down. Europe tried to shrink us to coordinates. Africa knew we were constellations. They charted our ports. We charted our purpose. And purpose, unlike empire, does not crumble. So when you see those old maps, those faded lines, those Latin letters spelling Judah on West African soil, understand this. That ain't a typo. That ain't a coincidence. That ain't some random colonial scribble. That's a fingerprint, a breadcrumb, a receipt. They mapped our coast because they wanted our bodies. They circled our kingdoms because they feared our crowns. They wrote Judah, Whidah, Ajuda, Jude, because even their compasses couldn't help but tremble around the echo of our name, Judah, Yehuda, Yehudim, children of the covenant standing on the shores of West Africa, waiting on ships we did not summon, wearing names we did not choose, holding memories we were ordered to forget. But memory don't die easy. Spirit don't vanish on command. Truth don't drown. They erased our stories from their classrooms, but they couldn't erase us from their cartography. Their own explorers betrayed their own historians. The maps told the truth their books tried to bury. They called the region Slave Coast after they broke it. But before the chains, before the auctions, before the names were stripped and shuffled like a deck of cursed cards, those same shores carried another title, Kingdom of Judah. Not in the Middle East, not in a book on a shelf, on our side of the water, on our soil, on our terms. You think that's light? You think that's random? They didn't just traffic bodies, they trafficked bloodlines. They trafficked prophecy. They trafficked people who sang ancient songs in new tongues, who held old laws and new customs, who kept quiet about certain things because the drum already knew the words. Look close at those maps. You'll see more than names. You'll see the path of a people hunted for their heritage, targeted for their testimony, scattered like seeds across oceans. Not just stolen Africans, but scattered Judah. Not just lost tribes, but living chapters. They told you your story started on a plantation. Lie. They told you your history began in chains. Lie. They told you Africa was just jungle and dust. Lie. Those maps whisper otherwise. They whisper of ports that were once palaces, of markets that were once meeting grounds for kings, priests, and scribes, of villages that debated scripture by moonlight. that braided prophecy into hairstyles, that hid commandments and proverbs and covenant in culture. So when you see Judah stamped on West African land, you're not just looking at geography, you're looking at genealogy. You're looking at a mirror they tried to crack. And you reading this now, sitting in a city they built on your backs, scrolling on a device their system designed, you are the glitch they didn't plan for, because the descendants of that scattered Judah are waking up in real time in the Americas, in the islands, in Europe, back home in Africa. Everywhere the ships dropped anchor, everywhere the chains were fastened, everywhere the names were changed. The memory is leaking back through the cracks. The maps are testifying, the bones are testifying, the rhythm in your chest is testifying. Something in you always knew you were more than a slave story, more than a side note in someone else's empire, more than a footnote in their fake history. You felt it when the church sermon didn't quite fit, but the drum pattern did. You felt it when the textbook called you property, but your spirit answered priesthood. You felt it when they told you to move on, but your soul said, no, go back and remember. So go back past the plantation, past the auction block, past the ship, past the dungeon, past the slave coast. Walk with your mind back into those old maps. See the word Judah sitting on West African soil like a witness on the stand. And listen. Listen to what it's saying. You were a people before you were a product. You were a covenant before you were cargo. You were a kingdom before you were a colony. They charted our ports. We charted our purpose. And purpose, don't drown in the Atlantic. Purpose, don't vanish in a ledger. Purpose, don't bow to empire or erase itself for comfort. Purpose survives in your blood, in your bones, in your questions, in your refusal to believe that chains were your beginning. Those old maps with Judah stamped on West African coasts are not just relics. They're reminders. Reminders that the story is bigger than the plantation, older than the colonizer, deeper than the textbooks, wider than the lies. And if the maps remembered us when the world tried to forget, then we owe it to ourselves to remember us now. Remember the Judah in West Africa. Remember the Judah in the diaspora. Remember the Judah in your own reflection, because the day we remember fully is the day the story shifts, the day the scattered start to gather, the day the buried names rise, the day the world has to admit what the maps have been whispering for centuries. They charted our ports. We charted our purpose. And purpose, unlike empire, does not crumble. Say it again, slow. They charted our ports. We charted our purpose, and purpose, unlike empire, does not crumble. And purpose, unlike empire, does not crumble.